I'm joined now by Neysun Mahboubi. He is from Philadelphia. He's a research scholar at the Center for the Study of Contemporary China at the University of Pennsylvania. You know, just watching that story, tariffs in states like Maine being impacted, others as well. You've got a lot of jittery members of Congress, governors as well, business people. They're nervous about how devastating this trade war can be. Is that going to likely impact or soften the Trump administration stance at all, do you think?
I think at the moment it's too early to say. There is actually quite a degree of support, even amongst the U.S. business community, for being tougher against Chinese trade practices of various sorts, whether they be limitations on market access or subsidies to state-owned enterprises or forced technology transfers. And so the business community, in fact, is I think, quite supportive of the Trump administration being tougher on China in a trade context. This particular mechanism of tariffs is potentially not the best way to address those issues and is going to start exacting costs like the one that you just described in your report in Maine. We're looking at farmers also in the Midwestern states are starting to hit some issues. So we'll have to see. There is definitely support for the administration being tougher on China, but whether this particular mechanism and the cost that it's exacting is going to continue to have support is going to be something to keep our eye on.
Of course, there's talk this week about a possible deal between the U.S. and the EU. What's the likely impact of that?
Well, in terms of the types of things that I talked about earlier, the concerns that the U.S. business community has had about Chinese trade practices, the EU has in many ways agreed with those concerns, and it's been puzzling that the U.S. has not done a better job of bringing the EU on board vis-a-vis its efforts vis-a-vis Chinese trade practices. The steel and aluminum tariffs that the U.S. imposed on the EU really complicated that picture. So you could say that this new agreement between the U.S. and the EU to keep talking and not to impose new tariffs in the auto sector or other sectors may show that the administration is bringing the EU along more to its side. But the reality is that there's very few specifics to this EU-U.S. agreement. In many ways, it resembles the statement that the U.S. made in May about putting Chinese trade war on hold. And we don't really know that it won't go back to a more confrontational stance between the U.S. and EU. So the signaling may seem promising if you want the U.S. and the EU to work together to combat Chinese trade practice, but the reality may be not so different from what we're seeing between the U.S. and China right now.
Today, the U.S. president was touting strong economic numbers, but a lot of analysts say that's because some countries and some companies were racing, trying to buy lots of products before the tariffs kicked in, and the next quarter is likely to be another story. Do you agree with that? And how long before the sting is actually felt? I know you were talking about farmers in the Midwest, the soybean farmers being nervous, but how long before you really see a sting?
Well, that's certainly true that today the number was quite positive for the Trump administration's messaging. And the economists have generally said that there was a confluence of factors, like you just mentioned, that may not be replicable in future quarters. But it's clear that President Trump likes this mechanism of tariffs. And this number, the GDP number that was announced today, 4.1%, I think, is something that will give him more confidence, at least in this next quarter. But if the number goes back down to the numbers that we've been more accustomed to, and you start having more and more stories like your story about the Maine lobstermen or the soy farmers in Iowa or what have you, then you're probably going to see some different political dynamics.
Neysun, we're going to leave it there. Thanks so much for joining us from Philadelphia. Appreciate it.